It's California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance coming to you from Sacramento, the state's capital. We are joined by Ted Lieu. He is a member of the California State Senate, also a nominee for the United States Congress in the 33rd Congressional District, which is currently held by Henry Waxman, a lion in the House of Representatives. We'll talk about following Mr. Waxman in a moment, assuming you are victorious. Let's talk about June primary. You pulled it out, my friend. How many candidates in the race?
There were 18 candidates, 2 dropped out before the actual primary night.
So everyone was really looking at that seat, trying to figure out who would come out in the top 2. There's no doubt that you were considered in the running for the top 2. What was your margin of victory? What exactly did you do that somehow got you into the top 2?
Well, I think the voters were very aware that they were losing a living legend, Henry Waxman. And when you think about why so many people love Henry Waxman, it was because he was effective. He was effective not just as a state legislator, but incredibly effective as a congressional legislator. And the voters, I think, were looking for who they thought would be effective in Congress. And I was the only candidate that had a record of delivering results for the district and also for California. And I think that weighed on the voters.
What's so interesting about the district, the 33rd, is I think when folks consider Henry Waxman, they think of him as a West Side legislator. But this district is a new district. And of course, the district takes in significant portions of the West Side, but it moves pretty far south into the South Bay, which is Ted Lieu territory that you've been representing in the Assembly and the Senate for about a decade.
It's certainly helpful to currently represent over 80% of the congressional district in the Senate district. And when I was in the Assembly, I represented nearly half of the likely voters in the Assembly district. So that was very helpful.
What's remarkable is you think about the South Bay versus the West Side, and they feel so far apart geographically, but they're just not. The freeway and the traffic makes them feel far apart, but they're contiguous. And if you look at a map, it makes absolute sense that the West Side would be paired up with the South Bay. It's right along the coast.
And many of the issues are the same.
And that was my question.
Right? Protecting the environment. It's a very coastal region, but also has beautiful mountains. So environmental protection is important to the voters in the district.
But I think it's fair to say that West Side, and let's talk about Democrats for a moment, West Side Democrats, a little different than South Bay Democrats. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, there's clearly more Democrats proportionally in the West Side than the South Bay. The
Right.
South Bay has somewhat more independents and somewhat more Republicans.
But it must have been a challenge. And when we think about the West Side, you're thinking about kind of limousine liberals, if I can use that cliche, that overused cliche. Whereas the South Bay, not as much. It's my cliche, not yours.
Right. It is a very diverse district. So I can go to the nation's longest running Armed Forces Day parade in Torrance, and then go to an anti-war rally in Venice on the same day.
True. And how many miles apart are they? 10, 15 miles? What were voters talking to you about?
So the environment was important, but also education. And it's clear to me that if we don't improve our education system, both K through 12 and higher education, we're not going to be able to compete in the 21st century.
When we come back, sir, I want to talk to you about the move to Washington, assuming victory in November. You will be moving from being part of a very significant majority as a Democrat in the state Senate to likely minority status in the House of Representatives. You never know what will happen in November, but as it stands today, it is likely you will be joining the minority party. And I want to get a sense from you how you play that card. His name is Ted Lieu, member of the California State Senate, nominee for U.S. Congress. I'm Brad Pomerance. We'll be right back. So, sir, let's talk about the potential, the likely, the probable minority status of your ascension to the U.S. Congress as a Democrat.
So I read Congressman Henry Waxman's book, The Waxman Report.
As did I.
Quite good. And you get a sense of the pace of federal legislation, which can take a long time. And so the Ryan White AIDS Act took Congressman Waxman 9 years to pass. And he was effective both when he was in the majority and when he was outside the majority. So when he was outside the majority, he would do hearings and he would issue minority reports. He would collect evidence. He would keep shining light on the issue. And when you do it many years, at some point, the evidence becomes so strong, you get bipartisan support for the legislation.
I wonder, though, if those days are behind us. Look, Watergate was a toxic time between the parties. Iran-Contra was a toxic time between the parties. Clinton impeachment, a toxic time. But this feels different. I mean, this feels really different.
So keep in mind, Congress changes every 2 years.
Yes.
And if you remember 2008 and 2010, the voters were very angry, and we were in a recession. They elected very angry legislators who didn't want to work a compromise. 2012, economy is better, somewhat less angry legislators were elected. And keep in mind, a few months ago, Congress passed a budget on a bipartisan basis. And so you do see some movement. And this November, you'll get more people into Congress that have never been there before. And as Congress starts to change, I think you're going to get a more well-functioning Congress as the economy starts to improve and less angry people get elected.
That being said, I think it's fair to say, at least on the Republican side, quote, the establishment has done fairly well vis-a-vis Tea Party challenges, but there is one race that I would be remiss if I didn't mention, and that is the loss of the majority leader in the U.S. House of Representatives, a man named Eric Cantor, representing Richmond and surrounding areas in a district that was slightly different than what he had represented in the last decade. He lost pretty handily to someone that one could argue is one of those angry folks. And so what is the takeaway from that?
And so obviously I wasn't there.
Right, you're not in Richmond.
So all I can do is read articles about what happened there. And I think it's hard to point to any single factor. I think multiple factors contributed. I believe the voters there felt that their member of Congress started to ignore the district and not come back to the district. I think they also did want to see some actions being taken in Congress. And when you have inaction and dysfunction, that hurts both Republicans and Democrats.
So, assuming you arrive in Washington in January, what do you hope to do when you first get there? There will be committee assignments.
Well, first is to learn the job, and so
very
I'm going to,
well stated.
Talk to my colleagues and talk to people who have been in Congress for a long time and get a sense of what's good to do in Congress and what are less effective things to do.
But as I understand it, you do get to have your preferences made and known, I should say, so you can speak to Ms. Pelosi and say, I'm interested in these committees.
Correct.
Are you willing to tell us what committees theoretically you may be interested in serving upon?
So I very focused on the November general election, so I haven't thought that
which is
quite
fair.
far ahead yet.
Which is fair.
But
what are your interests on the federal level? I mean, look, you're a member of the Naval Reserves, is that right?
Air Force Reserve.
Air Force Reserve. Yeah. So clearly defense, I mean, I shouldn't say clearly, but one could argue that maybe defense may be an interest of yours, maybe not.
So let me tell you why I ran for Congress.
Right.
California has done a lot of very good things in many areas, such as, for example, climate change. I believe climate change is an existential threat to humanity. And in California, we passed Assembly Bill 32, of which I was a co-author, a landmark global warming solutions law. But that only applied to one state. And it was clear to me, to really solve global warming, you need America to do what California has done. And then America to get the rest of the world to do what California has done, and I can only do that as a member of Congress.
But that's an example, though, of where the parties seem to be so incredibly divided that, virtually every single Democrat believes that global warming is a reality, and I think it would be fair to say that maybe a majority of the Republican caucus does not.
And again, the pace of federal legislation can be slow, but every year the evidence keeps on building that global warming is real and it's happening. And there was an interesting article in the New York Times a few months ago that talked about a town in Florida, very Republican, and now keeps flooding because of the rising ocean waters.
His name is Ted Lieu, member of the California State Senate, also nominee for U.S. Congress. I'm Brad Pomerance. It's California Edition.